Welcome to Crime Bedtime, your go-to channel for chilling, true crime bedtime stories. So snuggle up, close your eyes and let the stories unfold. Today we will be talking about the Yorkshire Ripper case. Peter William Sutcliffe was born in Bingley, West Yorkshire, on June 2nd, 1946, to John and Kathleen Sutcliffe. Growing up in a large working-class family as the youngest of 6 children, Peter's early life was marked by significant challenges. His father was a strict and sometimes abusive man who demanded discipline and control, often resorting to physical punishment to enforce his authority. John Sutcliffe's authoritarian approach created an atmosphere of fear and tension within the household. In contrast, Kathleen Sutcliffe was deeply religious and nurturing, providing a semblance of comfort and stability amidst the chaos. This conflicting parental influence created a turbulent home environment that left a lasting impact on Peter's psychological development. Peter was a quiet and shy child, often preferring solitude over the company of others. He found it difficult to make friends and was frequently bullied at school, which further isolated him. His academic performance was poor, and he showed little interest in his studies. He was a small, frail boy who struggled to assert himself. The bullying he endured compounded his feelings of inadequacy and alienation. Peter's poor academic performance and lack of social skills contributed to a sense of failure and frustration that he carried with him throughout his adolescence. He eventually left school at the age of 15 without any qualifications, beginning a series of unremarkable jobs. One of his earliest jobs was working as a gravedigger, a role that seemed to foreshadow his future crimes. During his time as a gravedigger, Peter developed a morbid fascination with death and corpses. This job, combined with his introverted nature, allowed him to withdraw further into his dark thoughts. The isolation and proximity to death during his work as a gravedigger seemed to deepen his existing feelings of morbidity and detachment from normal social interactions. Peter's relationship with women was complicated and troubling from an early age. He had a strong bond with his mother, who he saw as a symbol of purity and virtue. However, his father's infidelity deeply affected him, leading to a conflicted view of women. John Sutcliffe's frequent extramarital affairs were an open secret within the family, causing deep emotional wounds for young Peter. His father's behavior created a lasting impression, making Peter believe that women who were not like his mother were morally corrupt. This dichotomy between his idealized view of his mother and his contempt for other women fueled a growing resentment and confusion about female sexuality. As he entered adulthood, Peter's relationships with women remained strained. He was awkward and uncomfortable around them, which only fueled his resentment. He began to develop violent fantasies, particularly targeting sex workers. Peter's hatred for sex workers stemmed from his belief that they were immoral and deserving of punishment. This misogynistic view was deeply rooted in his psyche and would later manifest in his brutal attacks. His inability to form healthy relationships with women exacerbated his feelings of anger and rejection, driving him deeper into his dark fantasies. In 1974, Peter married Sonia Szurma, a schoolteacher of Czech and Polish descent. Despite his inner turmoil, their marriage appeared stable. Sonia was dedicated to her teaching career, and Peter worked as a truck driver. They moved to Bradford and settled into what seemed to be a normal life. However, Peter's violent fantasies continued to grow, hidden beneath the facade of normalcy. The couple's seemingly ordinary life provided the perfect cover for Peter's secretive and sinister activities. Sonia, unaware of her husband's dark side, continued to support him, oblivious to the horrors he was inflicting on innocent women. Peter's descent into violence began in 1969. Though not immediately identified as the Yorkshire Ripper, his first known assault involved attacking a woman with a stone in a sock. She survived, but this incident marked the start of a terrifying spree. Over the next few years, Peter's attacks escalated in both frequency and brutality. He targeted vulnerable women, often sex workers, luring them into secluded areas before unleashing his violent rage. His modus operandi included bludgeoning his victims with a hammer and then stabbing them repeatedly with a knife or screwdriver. The sheer brutality of his attacks shocked the nation and instilled fear in the hearts of women across the region. The first recognized victim of Peter Sutcliffe was Wilma McCann, a 28-year-old mother of four. On October 30th, 1975, Wilma, a known sex worker, was walking home after a night out in Leeds. Sutcliffe offered her a ride, drove her to Prince Philip playing fields, and attacked her. He struck her twice on the back of the head with a hammer, and as she fell to the ground, he continued his assault by stabbing her 15 times in the neck, chest, and abdomen. Her body was discovered the next morning, her lifeless form a grim prelude to the horrors Sutcliffe would continue to inflict. Emily Jackson, a 42-year-old part-time sex worker, was Sutcliffe's second victim. On January 20th, 1976, Emily was approached by Sutcliffe in Leeds, who offered her a ride. He drove her to a derelict building, where he struck her twice with a hammer. As she lay injured, he used a sharpened screwdriver to stab her 52 times in the neck, chest, and abdomen. The sheer brutality of the attack was shocking, with Sutcliffe even stomping on her thigh, leaving a distinct boot impression. Irene Richardson, a 28-year-old sex worker, met her end on February 5, 1977, in Roundhay Park, Leeds. After picking her up, Sutcliffe drove her to a secluded spot, where he hit her 3 times on the back of the head with a hammer. After she collapsed, he dragged her into the bushes and stabbed her multiple times. Her body was discovered the next day, further fueling the public's fear and outrage. Patricia Atkinson, a 32-year-old sex worker, was murdered on April 23, 1977, in her own flat in Bradford. Sutcliffe attacked her with a hammer, striking her 4 times before using a screwdriver to stab her in the stomach and chest. Blood stains and a boot print at the scene linked her death to the previous murders, confirming the presence of a serial killer. Jane MacDonald, a 16-year-old shop assistant, was an unexpected victim who did not fit the profile of a sex worker. On June 26, 1977, while walking home in Chapeltown, Leeds, she encountered Sutcliffe. He hit her on the head with a hammer, then dragged her body into a nearby playground, where he brutally stabbed her in the chest and back. Her death shocked the public, as she was a young, innocent girl, which broadened the perceived threat of the Yorkshire Ripper. Jean Jordan, a 20-year-old sex worker, was murdered on October 1, 1977, in Manchester. Sutcliffe struck her with a hammer, then attempted to hide her body in an allotment. Days later, he returned to move the body, fearing that a PS5 note he had given her could be traced back to him. In a frenzied attempt to obscure evidence, he mutilated her further, but the note was found, providing a critical lead for the police. Yvonne Pearson, a 21-year-old sex worker, was killed on January 21, 1978, in Bradford. Sutcliffe bludgeoned her with a hammer and then stuffed horsehair down her throat to ensure she was dead. He hid her body under a sofa, and she was not discovered until March, 2 months after her murder. Her death exemplified the brutality and premeditation of Sutcliffe's attacks. Helen Ritker, an 18-year-old sex worker, was murdered on January 31, 1978, in Huddersfield. Sutcliffe lured her into his car, drove to a timber yard, and struck her with a hammer. After dragging her out of the car, he stabbed her multiple times in the chest and back. Her body was found 2 days later, marking another tragic loss in Sutcliffe's violent spree. Vera Millward, a 40-year-old sex worker, was attacked on May 16, 1978, in the grounds of Manchester Royal Infirmary. Sutcliffe struck her with a hammer and then stabbed her repeatedly. Her death marked his 9th known victim and continued to baffle and terrorize the public. Josephine Whitaker, a 19-year-old building society clerk, was killed on April 4, 1979, in Halifax. Walking home after visiting her grandparents, she was struck from behind by Sutcliffe with a hammer. He then dragged her into a nearby building site, where he stabbed her 21 times with a screwdriver. Her murder broadened the scope of fear, as she was not a sex worker but a young professional woman. Barbara Leach, a 20-year-old university student, was murdered on September 20, 1979, in Bradford. Sutcliffe attacked her with a hammer as she was walking home from a night out with friends. He then stabbed her repeatedly and concealed her body under a pile of bricks and rubble. Her death garnered significant media attention, as she was another victim outside the initial profile of sex workers. Marguerite Walls, a 47-year-old civil servant, was killed on August 20, 1980, in Leeds. Sutcliffe attacked her as she walked home from work, hitting her with a hammer and strangling her with a piece of rope. Her murder indicated an escalation in his methods, adding strangulation to his violent repertoire. Jacqueline Hill, a 20-year-old student, was Sutcliffe's final known victim. On November 17, 1980, while returning to her university residence in Headingley, Leeds, she was attacked with a hammer and stabbed multiple times. Her murder, near the University of Leeds, caused widespread fear among students and increased pressure on the authorities to capture the killer. Peter Sutcliffe also attacked several other women who survived, but his reign of terror left an indelible mark on the communities he targeted. His brutal methods and the fear he instilled underscored the tragic loss of life and the profound impact on the victims' families and the broader society. Sutcliffe would often drive around red light districts and other areas frequented by sex workers, looking for potential victims. He drove a variety of vehicles over the years, which allowed him to move around without arousing too much suspicion. Sutcliffe would engage his victims in conversation, often offering them money for sex or simply offering them a ride. This initial contact was usually calm and disarming, which helped him gain their trust. Once he had lured a victim into his car or to a secluded location, Sutcliffe's demeanor would change dramatically. He typically used a hammer to strike his victims on the head, a method chosen for its lethal efficiency and the ability to quickly incapacitate his victims without attracting attention. The initial blows with the hammer would render the victim unconscious or severely injured. After the initial attack with the hammer, Sutcliffe would often drag his victims to an even more secluded spot if they were not already in one. He then used a knife or a sharpened screwdriver to stab them multiple times. The stabbing was not random, it was frenzied and focused on the chest and abdomen, indicating a deep-seated rage and a desire to mutilate. The number of stab wounds varied, but the brutality was consistent, leaving no doubt about his intent to kill. In some cases, Sutcliffe made attempts to hide the bodies of his victims. He would cover them with debris, hide them in remote areas, or leave them in positions that would delay their discovery. This not only bought him time to escape, but also added to the horror when the bodies were eventually found. However, he often left the crime scene hastily, which sometimes resulted in the discovery of crucial evidence. In 1978, during the height of the Yorkshire Ripper's reign of terror, the West Yorkshire police received a series of letters and an audio tape. These were signed by a person who identified himself as Jack the Ripper. The letters were postmarked from Sunderland, a city far from the actual crime scenes in West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester, and they claimed responsibility for the killings. The first letter, dated March 8, 1978, read, "Dear Sir, I am sorry I cannot give my name for obvious reasons. I am the Ripper. I've been dubbed a maniac by the press, but not by you. You call me clever, and I am. You and your mates haven't a clue that photo in the paper gave me fits. And that bit about killing myself, no chance. I've got things to do. My purpose to rid the streets of them sluts. My motto is treat M like they treat dirt. I'm Jack the Ripper. Yours, Jack the Ripper." The second letter, dated March 13, 1978, followed a similar theme and was even more mocking. "Dear Sir, I have the greatest respect for you, George, but Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started. I reckon your boys are letting you down, George. You can't be much good, can ya? The only time they came near catching me was a few months back in Chapeltown when I was disturbed. Even then it was a uniformed copper, not a detective. I warned you in March that I'd strike again. Sorry it wasn't Bradford. I'm not quite sure when I'll strike again, but it will be definitely sometime this year. Maybe September or October even. I'm not sure yet. I haven't decided what yet, but it will be one of them. Sorry about the girls who escaped. I know I made a mess of it. But remember, it won't be a pretty sight when I strike again. I told you before, it will be when I feel like it. Yours, Jack the Ripper. The third letter, dated May 21st, 1979, showed an escalation in tone and a hint of foreboding. Dear Sir, you are doing very well. The press are giving me some good write-ups. I sometimes wonder how many more of them will go up north to see what I do, but I am sure they cannot catch me yet. It's all down to me getting a place to hide. Now they have my blood group to help them. But you will hear from me before long. I shall be in the newspapers and on the television. Yours, Jack the Ripper. In addition to the letters, the hoaxer sent an audio tape in June 1979. The tape was addressed to Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield, who was leading the investigation. The recording was of a man with a distinctive Wearside accent, saying, "I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George, but Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started. I reckon your boys are letting you down, George. You can't be much good, can ya?" The hoax letters and tape had a significant impact on the investigation. The distinctive Wearside accent led the police to focus their efforts on Sunderland and the surrounding areas, convinced that the killer was from there. This focus caused a critical diversion from the actual perpetrator, Peter Sutcliffe, who continued his killing spree while the police chased a phantom in the wrong location. Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield, who had put a great deal of trust in the authenticity of the letters and tape, launched an extensive campaign to find the man behind the voice. This involved interviewing thousands of men in the Sunderland area, yet all the while, the real Yorkshire Ripper remained at large, continuing to commit murders in West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester. It wasn't until 1979 that the hoax began to unravel. Forensic analysis eventually determined that the letters and tape did not match the blood type or handwriting of Peter Sutcliffe. The revelation that the letters and tape were a cruel prank was a devastating blow to the investigation. By the time Sutcliffe was apprehended in January 1981, the true cost of the diversion caused by the hoax letters was clear. Several women had been murdered while police resources were misdirected. The hoax letters and tape remain a chilling reminder of how misinformation can hinder justice and cause further tragedy. The man behind the hoax was never officially identified, although in 2005 a man named John Humble from Sunderland was arrested and confessed to being the hoaxer, also known as Wearside Jack Humble, was convicted of perverting the course of justice and sentenced to 8 years in prison. The hoax letters serve as a dark footnote in the history of the Yorkshire Ripper case, highlighting the complexities and challenges faced by those seeking to bring a violent predator to justice. Sutcliffe's reign of terror continued from 1975 until his capture in 1981. Despite numerous close encounters with the police and surviving victims providing descriptions, he managed to evade capture for years. His eventual apprehension was almost accidental. On January 2, 1981, Sutcliffe was stopped by police officers in Sheffield for driving with false number plates. The officers, Sergeant Robert Ring and Constable Robert Hydes, became suspicious and decided to bring him in for further questioning. While Sutcliffe was in custody, the officers discovered a set of tools in his car that matched those used in the Yorkshire Ripper's attacks, including a hammer and a knife. Sutcliffe believed that he was chosen by God to eliminate sex workers, whom he viewed as morally corrupt and deserving of punishment. He claimed that he heard voices, which he interpreted as messages from God, instructing him to carry out these murders. This delusional sense of divine purpose was a central theme in his justification for his crimes. Sutcliffe's intense hatred for sex workers was rooted in his belief that they were immoral and needed to be eradicated. This misogynistic view was deeply embedded in his psyche and played a significant role in his selection of victims. His father's infidelity and the resulting family turmoil likely influenced this perception, leading him to associate sex workers with moral decay and corruption. The violent nature of Sutcliffe's attacks suggested a need for control and dominance over his victims. By selecting vulnerable women, often sex workers, he could exert his power and fulfill his violent fantasies. The brutal manner in which he killed, striking his victims with a hammer and stabbing them repeatedly, indicated a deep-seated rage and a desire to exert ultimate control over their lives. Sutcliffe's psychological state was characterized by severe mental illness, including paranoid schizophrenia, as argued by his defense during the trial. His actions were influenced by his mental health issues, which manifested in violent and delusional behavior. Despite his defense team's argument, the jury concluded that he was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. In his confession, Sutcliffe provided chilling details about how he selected his victims, the methods he used, and the rationale behind his actions. Sutcliffe's trial was one of the most high-profile and sensational in British criminal history. It took place at the Old Bailey in London, beginning on May 5, 1981. Sutcliffe's defense team, led by James Chadwin QC, argued that he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia and that his killings were the result of his mental illness. They presented psychiatric evidence to support this claim, hoping to secure a verdict of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility rather than murder. The prosecution, led by Sir Michael Havers QC, contended that Sutcliffe was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. They argued that his detailed planning, attempts to cover his tracks, and the consistent pattern of his crimes indicated that he was not insane, but rather a cold and calculating killer. The jury was tasked with deciding whether Sutcliffe's mental state at the time of the murders significantly impaired his responsibility. After 2 weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury rejected the defense's argument of diminished responsibility. On May 22, 1981, Sutcliffe was found guilty of 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. Sutcliffe was sentenced to 20 concurrent life sentences, with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 30 years. In 2010, this recommendation was extended to a whole life tariff, meaning he would never be released from prison. Sutcliffe's trial and conviction brought a sense of closure to the families of his victims and the public, but it also highlighted significant flaws in the police investigation. The reliance on the hoax letters and tape, which diverted resources and attention away from Sutcliffe, was a major point of criticism. The case led to reforms in how serial crimes were investigated and the importance of communication and cooperation between different police forces. Sutcliffe was imprisoned at Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric hospital, before being transferred to HM Prison Frankland. He died on November 13, 2020, after contracting COVID-19. Now it's time to slowly drift into sleep. Close your eyes, let go, and allow sleep to gently carry you away into a night of sweet dreams and restful slumber.